I'd like to start out today with a quote from Joseph Smith. "Let us here observe that a religion that does not require the sacrifice of all things never has power sufficient to produce the faith necessary unto life and salvation." It's a well-known quote by the prophet. Does anyone know where he gave that quote? Where that quote originally appeared? It was in the Doctrine and Covenants for many years, and it was taken out in the 20th century. That's your
Lectures
quote.
on Faith.
Lectures on Faith. All right. So that was one of the quotes in Lectures on Faith. I want to read it again. Let us here observe that a religion that does not require the sacrifice of all things never has power sufficient to produce the faith necessary unto life and salvation. When you're talking about early church history, and Joseph Smith in particular, you're talking a lot about sacrifice. And to understand fully the sacrifice, it's good to start with his family. He's the son of Joseph Smith Sr. and Lucy Mack Smith. The Smith family originally was from Massachusetts. The first Smith came over in the mid-17th century, settled in Massachusetts. Generally speaking, they were farmers. They tilled the land, and they lived for many, many generations in Massachusetts. And Joseph Smith Sr. was really one of the first to move out and have a base elsewhere. He was the third of 11 children and the second oldest boy. And in 18th century New England, that was important, because that meant that he was generally going to work his life for the benefit of the oldest boy. And so he immediately set out, and that's what he did. He worked very hard to contribute to the family for the education of the oldest son. So anyway, he was the third of 11 children, the second oldest boy of Assail Smith and Mary Duty. His father, Assail, was the son of Captain Patrick Smith and Priscilla Gould. Assail's mother died when he was an infant, Priscilla Gould. And so he was raised by his cousin, and this cousin eventually became his stepmother. He was treated very poorly by her as a child, and he was eventually sent to labor on farms. So they would, in essence, lend out boys as almost indentured servants to other farms, and they would work, and the family would receive a portion of the crop. And sometimes some money, but generally it was payment in kind to the family for the use of the strong arms. And certainly Joseph Sr. was that. He was over 6 feet tall and weighed well over 200 pounds. He was a very strong man. He married Mary Duty, and they purchased a farm in Vermont. He would plant in the spring, fight with the British Army in the summer, harvest in the fall, and teach school in the winter. So he had multiple jobs.
Well-rounded.
That's right. Assail is who I'm talking about. He had a birth defect that made his head tilt to one side, and he was known in New England as Crooked Neck Smith. He and Mary were never baptized, but he frequently made prophecies about his family revolutionizing religion. He would often say, someone in my family is going to change the world in religion. He was never baptized. Late in his life, he was told that Joseph had about the first vision and about the Book of Mormon, about Doctrine and Covenants, and when he was told, his response was, I'm paraphrasing, "I'm not surprised. I knew that someone in my family, that this would be their role." And he never joined the church, but he was very accepting of the gospel. Mary, late in life, in her 90s, which, by the way, they both lived into their 90s, which is rare in that time. But Mary, in her 90s, did the trip out to Kirtland. And she arrived in Kirtland, and within 2 weeks she passed after arriving in Kirtland. But she went out there with the intent of joining the church. Assail and Mary, again, had 11 children, and one of them was Joseph Sr. Lucy Mack was the youngest of 8, so now the prophet's mother. She was the youngest of 8 children. Her grandfather was landed and wealthy, but a series of bad business ventures left him destitute. He turned his son over to a family who owned a farm and needed a strong pair of hands, and the son lived there until the age of 21. This is Lucy Mack's father. At the age of 21, he ran away and joined the British Army and participated in many battles with the French and Indians. After 8 years, he was discharged and invested all of his savings in purchasing the township that is now Granville, Vermont. And he purchased that township with the understanding that he would build X amount of buildings. So he contracted out the construction of the buildings in Granville, and then he fell ill with the consumption, and which is, I think, 19th century version of the flu. So he fell ill with the consumption, and in the process, the gentleman he had contracted to build all the required buildings to own the land ran off with the money. So he lost all the land in Granville that he had spent all of his military savings on, all of his bounty that he received as a soldier in the British Army. So at that point, he took his two oldest sons and they joined the Continental Army to fight against the British. One thing you need to know about both the Macks and the Smiths is that they all, the uncles and the dads, and they all fought in the Revolutionary War. They were all extremely patriotic, and they fought against the British, and so did Lucy Mack's father. He and his boys, Lucy Mack's brothers, were in the Merchant Marines, and they fought many battles on land and sea. Lucy's mother was a teacher, and by her father's description was, quote, a most pious and devout companion that ever lived. Pious and devout, excuse me. She was the most pious and devout companion that ever lived. And they both lived into their 80s. So now you have Joseph Smith's grandparents. And on his father's side, both of them live into their 90s. And on mother's side, they both live into their 80s. So you have a tradition in that family of big, strong, resilient, they fall on hard times, they bounce back, people. And that's what Lucy's used to, and that's what Joseph's used to. So now here comes their family. So they settle eventually in Sharon, Vermont. They had 11 children, 8 boys and 3 girls. Of the 8 boys, by 1844, 7 of the 8 boys would be dead. So, let me read again. Joseph says, let us here observe that a religion that does not require the sacrifice of all things never has power sufficient to produce the faith necessary to life and salvation. So think about Lucy Mack Smith, the mom. By 1844, 7 of her 8 sons are dead, and her husband. He died too, of exposure when they fled far west to go to Nauvoo. He never recovered. Of their boys, there was a firstborn who they didn't name, who was stillborn, so I counted that as one of the 8. Okay, that boy. Then Alvin, who they considered the oldest, was 7 years older than the prophet. He died at age 25 from mercury poisoning. That he was given calomel for the flu, and they gave him too much, and he got mercury poisoning. And this was during the time the prophet was trying to get the plates, to give you a reference of when that happened. The time when Joseph was trying to get the plates, his brother Alvin died of poisoning. Of course, Hiram was 5 years older, and he was martyred with the prophet. And then the prophet and Hiram were martyred in 1844. Sam was 3 years younger than the prophet, and he died of exposure from fleeing the mob the night of the assassination. So he was on his way to Carthage the night of the assassination when a rider came and said, the prophet's been killed, and they're headed to Nauvoo. And on his way back to Nauvoo, he was intercepted by the mob, and he fled the mob during that night. And the exposure from being outside through that night, he fell ill, and he never recovered, and he died. So we always talk about Hiram and Joseph being martyrs, but I think almost directly, or at least indirectly, we have to include Sam in that. Ephraim was 5 years younger than the prophet, and he died at birth. Don Carlos was 11 years younger than the prophet, and he died from malaria during the settlement of Nauvoo. So he died, he was 11 years younger, but he died before Joseph. And he died of malaria, because you know that when we get to Nauvoo, we'll talk about what it was like there. And malaria was rampant. He was one of the ones that died of that. The only other brother was William. And he was 6 years younger than the prophet. He was at one time an apostle and a patriarch, but he was completely apostate and excommunicated by October of 1845. That's the only son that lived. And he lived to be elderly. I don't have the exact year written down, but he lived to a ripe old age.